Okay, so now we'll begin with episode 4. This is James and Jude, what was not discussed in Gray's book, which was supposed to review the Apostle Paul and his critics through the centuries, and instead he focused on Al Qaeda, Hitler, Nietzsche, and maybe Kierkegaard, the only Christian he seemed to pay much attention to, and otherwise just made it look like he made disappear all the true in-depth scriptural references that were anti-Pauline. And so let's look at how he handled James and Jude. That's clearly anti-Paul, right? I mean, you can't miss it. Okay, well, let's take a look at how Gray handled the two most obvious. The two most obvious books that are anti-Paul are James, who takes the same passages that Paul's talking about and characterizes them completely opposite of the way Paul reads them, and then Jude, who talks about somebody who teaches the gospel of grace, which is just an invitation to licentiousness. And then he says the same person is teaching the doctrines of Balaam, which were you can eat meat sacrificed to idols. So I mean, you'd have to be living in a cave not to know what these two works are talking about. But let's just see what Gray says about this. In Gray's list of canonical sources of anti-Paulinism, Gray mentions there are two possible canonical critics of Paul, namely James and Jude. He says this at 50608 of his Kindle. But as to James, he quickly marshals there is a panoply of interpretations that dismiss James' words that man is justified by faith alone is supposedly not truly about Paul's doctrine. See James 2, verse 14. Thus, Gray raises only doubts whether James is really addressing Paul. So that's it. 2 minutes, not even a minute, just one sentence. Just take a look at these books. I don't have to talk about it in depth. I don't have to. It's no debate. There is no more debate. They're not conflicting. They're not contradicting. However, he's wrong, but it's obvious that all of James' epistle addresses Paul, as Augustine pointed out in 413 AD, as discussed above. For James not only takes on Paul's claim of faith alone and crushes it, but he also takes on Paul's assertion that Abraham was justified by faith alone and crushes it too. In fact, there are over 11 topic areas that James refutes Paul. And we've done a recent video on that, so I'm not going to repeat that. Luther had it right by looking not just at the verse, faith alone does not justify, in James 2, verse 24, as Gray does. That's all he looked at. Instead, Luther also compared 2, verse 24 to James 2:21, which likewise contradicted Paul's view that Abraham was supposedly justified by faith alone. So you can't just look at one verse, Mr. Gray. You got to look at both of the key verses, and you got to look at Luther's quote. I mean, in fairness, you should have provided Luther's quote and then said why you disagree with it. But here's Luther's quote, because he's directly showing you the contradictions. As Luther wrote, many sweat hard at reconciling James to Paul, but unsuccessfully. Faith justifies. Romans 3, verse 28 stands in flat contradiction of faith that does not justify. James 2, verse 24. If anyone can harmonize these sayings, I'll put my doctor's cap on him and let him call me a fool. Flatly against St. Paul and all the rest of Scripture. It, the book of James, ascribes righteousness to works. That's against all of Scripture. Jesus in the sheep and the goats says the same thing. All right, we'll just not quibble. And says Abraham was justified by his works in that he offered his son Isaac. That's James 2, verse 21. Though St. Paul, on the contrary, teaches in Romans 4, verses 2 to 3, that Abraham was justified without works, by faith alone, before he offered up his son, and proves it by Moses in Genesis 15:6. All right, and so he should have mentioned that, but he doesn't. And so they do conflict. I mean, those are directly contrary statements. Incidentally, I think another thing is you've got to probably mention, if you're going to talk about these two passages and whether the conflict is, you have to understand that James is reading the Hebrew Bible. He should be reading the Hebrew Bible, but Paul isn't. Paul is able to read Greek very well, so he gets the wrong idea. So incidentally, Paul's error in Romans 4, verse 2 to 3 was to rely upon the ambiguous part of the mistranslation of Genesis 15, verse 6 by the Septuagint Greek translation from 257 BC. This is discussed in full in our book, Jesus' Words on Salvation, chapter 26, part 7, at this link, which is free online at the webpage we've told you about, jesuswordsonly.com/github.io. In the original Hebrew, it merely says that Abraham regarded God's promise of a son in old age as justice or righteousness toward Abraham. It had nothing to do with salvific justification by faith, let alone by faith alone. Hence, Gray's treatment of whether James is truly anti-Paul gives undue weight to dismissive views that are simply not credible and overlook the wider context of James' epistle. Even Luther recognized the importance of not isolating James 2 verse 24 from 2 verse 21. The latter verse makes James' point in 2 verse 24 unmistakably a criticism of Paul's doctrine of faith alone. So Gray was completely wrong, and he dismissed it way too quickly and needed to go through a statement by the founder of the Reformation on why these two conflict and contradict. So you can't just, it's not a vote of, there are 10 people say it's not a contradiction, and you have one person who's showing you who translated the Bible, by the way. So he has some sense of what the two passages mean. You should give him at least a voice in this debate. He said they contradict, and you're just ignoring that. But anyway, so, and more importantly, he was an anti-Paul he was an anti-James view, okay? So that proves that there was a contradiction, and you could go one of two ways. You could go anti-Paul, because James could be the more valid source, or you could go anti-James, which is how Luther went. So the viewpoint that Paul is contradicting James is a valid one. And then the question is, who is more valid? James, the brother of Jesus, the bishop of Jerusalem, or Paul, who was never appointed in 3 accounts of what happened on the road to Damascus? He was never appointed as an apostle of Jesus Christ. That's a fact. It's chapters Acts 9, 22, and 26. Never, ever once. All right, so now we're going to do Jude, but I'm going to put it on another slide. Okay, so the same defect applies to Gray's treatment of Jude. Gray again solely focuses upon a single verse in Jude. This isolated verse is about an ungodly person who has perverted God's, quote, grace to open a door for licentiousness. This is Kindle at 544. But Gray quickly dismisses its importance to proving Jude is aimed at Paul, ignoring the clear evidence that in multiple verses in Jude we recognize Paul as the obvious target. So you can't just take one thing and say that I've answered every doubt there could possibly be. No, you got to look at all the commentary that says it's an anti-Paul work by people who are defenders of Paul, which I'll show you. George Reber is a defender of Paul, and he says Epistle of Jude is here. Let's just jump there. George Reber, a Paul defender, in The Christ of Paul, defensively said, quote, "The Epistle of Jude is nothing but a bolt hurled at the head of Paul." And if you want to see all the lists of the proofs of how they conflict, I have a whole link where I list them all. There's numerous contradictions of Paul by Jude. But just here's some key highlights. For example, Jude equates a wolf in sheep's clothing. Think about who Paul is. He claims to be a sheep, right? He's wearing sheep's clothing. He claims to be a Christian. What's the wolf? It's an image from Genesis 49, verse 27, I think it is, that there's going to Benjamite wolf and Benjamite wolf who will go after the flock in the end of days. And so I think he's even referring to Genesis 49, verse 27. So he says there's a wolf in sheep's clothing who has penetrated Christianity with a lawless doctrine that twists God's grace into licentiousnness. Who could that be? And most importantly, shares the lessons of Balaam. Who could that be? Jesus tells us what Balaam taught. The latter aspect clearly refers to Paul, because Paul taught Balaam's doctrine, which Jesus references and then condemned in Revelation 2, verse 14, that it was inherently okay to eat meat sacrificed to idols, although not expedient when around a brother who thinks it's wrong. This is in 1 Corinthians 10, verses 28 to 29. Check it out. 1 Corinthians 8, verses 4 to 12. And again, the 10 verses 28 to 29, you got to read 29, because Paul will say, when you're around a brother who thinks there's something wrong eating the meat sacrificed to idols, don't eat for conscience sake. And then if you stop reading there, you don't read the next sentence. It says, I'm not talking about I'm talking about his conscience, not my conscience. For why is my conscience and my freedom controlled by what somebody else thinks is wrong? And so he's clearly saying the stronger conscience, me, meaning Paul, I know that there's nothing wrong eating meat sacrificed to idols. So he violates the commands from Jesus, and we have a whole series on that. And it's just considered by God to be horrific. It's not like eating unclean meat. It's way beyond that. It's a spiritual wrong thing to do. We've already told you about George Reber says Jude is nothing but an epistle hurled at that. So clearly, in context, Jude is super anti-Paul. Super anti-Paul. There could be nobody else who's in mind here. Teaches grace, lawlessness, penetrated Christianity. He's a wolf in sheep's clothing, shares the lessons of Balaam, teaches us we can eat meat sacrificed to idols. Who do you think it is? And people say, well, he didn't use his name. Oh my goodness, what what does it take for people to say, well, he doesn't use somebody's name, but he's thinking of somebody? There's 4 or 5 characteristics that all fit one person. And let me suggest to you, do you think it's possible that it really originally said the name Paul? I do. But you got to know that the Roman Catholic Church wanted Paul to be important. And because why? Because he twice repealed Sabbath and said Sabbath is, you no longer have to follow Sabbath. And remember, why did Constantine put everybody on a paycheck? He's made all the leaders of the Christian church in Rome all employees of the state. Now they all are getting high-paying jobs. They all were given power to rule over people. Okay, what was the price they had to do? You have to make sure people worship on Sunday, the day of my God of the sun, Sol Invictus. That's what I want. It was the price we had to pay. Okay, gotta get here on the screen. Okay, so let's see. Is there anything else? Thus, Gray too quickly dismisses these canonical sources of Jude and James as not truly anti-Pauline. In fact, as we saw in our discussion above of 2 Peter, Augustine in 413 AD said 2 Peter, James, and Jude were written systematically to criticize the faith alone doctrine in Paul's writings. This was an error Paul did not intend. So this is in Augustine's work called Faith and Works, if you want to go take a look at it. Peter says, per Augustine, but due to the lack of intelligibility in Paul's writings, the ignorant and unstable interpret Paul as saying, we do not lose salvation once we have faith. What James and Jude intended against Paul's writings in that regard is obvious as well, and many Paulinists blind themselves to it. Okay, so we will now conclude this episode, and we'll get to the next episode, which we'll talk about a very important passage, Matthew 5, verse 17 to 19.